this would be anybody that wanted to come into this framework that's being established could create a page like this and introduce anybody else that they wanted to into their own world about what they're doing, how they're doing it, what the specifics of it are, and so forth. And that will be explained a bit more online and as we go forward in the future. This is all designed to be a stepping off point for advancing the whole notion of activism, and particularly health freedom activism, into the future. What I'm going to talk about is how we got there, how I got there, and some of the things that I talk about will include how people here got there. And Dana is, I don't know what she's doing, but she's supposed to change the slide now. Dana? I wanted to, this partly introducing me, so to speak. I ended up working with Ralph Nader in 1968, 50 years ago. June 1968 was when I got my first activist paycheck. Before that, I was an activist, but it was for free. You know, I did other things for a living, and I did activism for free. And there are just things about the Nader experience. That day we got out, there were a couple hundred Naders Raiders. We were in front of the Capitol. How many people remember Ralph Nader from those days? How many people know of Ralph Nader as an auto safety advocate? So I was sitting with people at lunch today, and I mentioned that, and they said, I didn't know he had anything to do with the Carters. That was pretty funny. So I'm going to do two things about Nader to give you a sense of what something about the way activism works and the dynamic of doing policy. And Ralph, I ended up working with Ralph really because I was assigned a law school class, which was called the Auto Safety Summit, 1966. His book had been out just about 9 months when I got into this class. And the teacher, the law professor, picked 15 students to be in this Auto Safety Summit, and he had them each play a role. One was the head of General Motors, one was Senator Magnuson, who was doing auto safety hearings, and then one was Ralph Nader, me. He appointed me to play Ralph Nader. I have no idea why, but he picked me out of the crowd and said, you be Ralph Nader, read everything, write about your character, write a brief, we met once a week for a year, write a brief about his position on auto safety, and then we'll have a big auto safety summit. We'll have everybody come to the moot court room for a day, graded by 3 law professors, and present an oral argument about your person. So I read what Nader had to say about things, and it was clear to me that he was not actually talking about auto safety, even though he was massively presented across the society as an auto safety advocate. What he was talking about was corporate responsibility. And he would say, in his professional writings, law journals and so forth, decisions in America today are being made by concentrated economic interests, primarily corporations. One page. The bottom line of which was, that's not a really good thing, or that's a really bad thing. Let me give you an example. Automobiles, and then 60 pages on automobiles. So everybody talked about the automobile part of the argument, nobody talked about the corporate responsibility part. So I wanted to meet Nader and say, listen, you need to have help, you're doing this all by yourself, and maybe some people could help, and you really need to understand what you're talking about. I met with him, it took me a year to track him down, I sent resumes, I'd hear my friends would say, he's speaking here, he's speaking there, I'd send a resume. I came to Washington it was actually March of 1968. I came there and a friend of mine said he was home between 11 and 12 in the morning to take phone calls. So at 11:05, Monday morning, spring break, 1968, I went to a phone booth across the street from his house, and I called him. And he picks up and says, Ralph. And I said, I'm Jim Turner. And he said, are you the guy who's been sending the resumes? And I said, yes. He said, I'll get back to you. That was my first conversation with Nader. About 4 days later, he called me when I was sitting down to dinner and said, let's have dinner. And I went and had dinner. And I explained this business about the not getting the story on corporations. And he said, well, how would you handle that problem? And I said, if you're right, which I think you are, we should be able to pick anything. Look at it using this process and you'll find the same thing. He said, I think that's a good idea. What would you pick? And I said, well, what would you pick? He said, well, what would you pick? I said, well, what would you pick? Finally, I said food, because we were interested in food. And he said, food, that's great. I was a cook in the Army for 6 months. I bet you nobody knew that. How many knew that Nader was a cook in the Army for 6 months? Yeah, because that's how I told you the story before. So we started out, and the way you start that process is you're in Washington, and you go look at the regulatory agencies. There are 55 of these regulatory agencies regulating some sector of the economy, and the FDA is regulating food. So we go and look at food. Now I just want to put one more thing in quickly about Ralph, because he was simultaneously the most sophisticated and the most naive person I worked with. I mean, it was just incredible. So we're walking down the street one day, and he stopped and he pointed at the Brookings Institution. You know what Brookings Institution is? It's like one of the premier think tanks in Washington. And he pointed at that, and he said, comfort breeds banality. Think about that. Comfort breeds banality. That summarizes most of the think tank work that goes on in Washington. I mean, they've got lots of money, they go to work, they sit there and they write this stuff and they pour this stuff out. It's not bad stuff, but it's not at the heart of what's really going on. And he got that, just comfort breeds banality. Another time I'm walking down the street with him, and we walked in front of the National Theater, and he stops, he says, Jim, a lot of people are telling me I should see this musical, or this show, he called it. So a lot of people said I should see the show. Why do you think that is? Man of La Mancha. You get it? Man of La Mancha?
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote, Ralph Nader, windmills, corporations. So, I mean, he really wanted to know, you know. So this is that's kind of a summary of that story. Unsafe at Any Speed was a major book that made a big splash. Didn't make Nader a big name. What made Nader a big name was being followed by General Motors. And I get into the consumer stuff, but these people would come up to me and they'd say, oh man, that Nader guy, you know, General Motors is really stupid. They were really, really stupid. This guy told me this. He said they were really stupid because, you know, I know how to find a detective that would not have gotten caught following Ralph Nader. I mean, you know, okay. In any case, that's in the wrong order, but yeah, okay, here you go. The next person I met in Washington, D.C., the very first person I met when I got to Washington in June, after I met with Ralph in June and went to work, Clinton Miller. Clinton Miller was the premier food activist of Washington in 1968. And I went over to meet him. And it was very interesting. Clinton Miller, in my first conversation, you know, he was just ebullient, you know, full of stuff. And he said this to me, and I'm trying to figure out, how does Washington work? Here I am. And Clint says, you know, that FDA commissioner, I went over and talked to him. And, you know, he is not a very responsive person. And he takes out a picture out of his coat, and it's a picture of a longhorn cow with the horns uncurled and touching the ground. And he says, I took this picture and I showed it to the commissioner of the FDA, and I said, you see, that's what happens from food additives. And he says, you know, the guy's never called me. Now, you know, I also learned from Clinton how you generate, like, you know, 150,000 letters to Congress, which was done at that point. Subsequently, another, you know, when we did Deshea back in 1994, 1.5 million letters to Congress, largest number of letters on any issue. The previous number was 1 million that went in on the Proxmire Act, which was the preliminary thing to Deshea in 1976. The community for food safety, for health freedom, for individual rights and health is huge. And when it gets engaged, it shifts everything. Well, you saw that, you know, the white of the bread, the sooner you're dead. He had many of those things. And he introduced me to all kinds of fascinating people. One of which was names are hard these days. My database is so full of stuff. Betsy? The actress, you know? Gloria Swanson. See, it's just slow. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson was a fantastic food advocate. I mean, amazing. Great star and all this kind of stuff. A very, very smart woman. And, you know, Clinton, her friend, introduced, she used to call me and ask, what should I say? I'm going to be in a TV show. What should I say about food safety? And Clinton knew all kinds of people like that. And then what happened as I went along over the years is I started meeting other people. Diane Miller. We've been working together, I think, 30 years now, Diane, something like that. Since 1990, is that what, 90, 28 years? Very close to that. And then we had next Sally Fallon. Sally Fallon came from Weston A. Price, came to us at our firm before there was a Weston A. Price. And we talked about stuff, and we've been the counsel for Sally ever since. Now my point here is that this kind of activism moves along and develops. It's a way of being, it's a way of seeing. I think it's an empirical, hands-on way. People look at reality, they say, oh, that's real. And they run into people who have, or a system who has created a bunch of abstractions, a bunch of rules, a bunch of frameworks. And the people who look at the real stuff come over to the people who are looking at through the lens of rules and so forth. And these people say, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I mean, look, here's the rule. You got to do this, this, and this. You say, well, wait, it's a lousy rule. That's the rule. Doesn't matter whether it's a lousy rule or not. And you just heard several stories about how you got to go in there and work at it. And then the next one is from the vaccine issue. Barbara Flo Fisher, and Barbara was a very interesting character to work with. It's what happened, we had and there's a little bit about this later, but we had an involvement in 1976. I got a call in 1970. I was working with Nader at the time, and I continued to work on and then I got a call on the vaccine issue, and I worked on that issue from 1970 to 1981. We worked, I mean, continued after that, but those were big issues. And the guy that called me was the former Secretary of Health and Human Services, or HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, John Gardner, famous American. And he called me and he said, I was secretary and there was something I learned after I got out, there's something wrong in vaccine regulation. Would you, Jim, be willing to look into it? I've asked all the investigative reporters in Washington to look into it, and none of them will do it. So I said, sure. And I started, and I started looking at vaccines, and what a mess. You cannot believe what a mess it was. This is 1970. In 1970, we had a hearing in front of the United States Senate Committee, in which the issue of mercury in vaccines, we raised that issue in 1970. And what happened in that situation is we were able to eliminate the Division of Biologic Standards, which regulated vaccines then, and I saw it going over to FDA, and I said, oh God, we're in trouble now. But that agency was really bad. The FDA, we had a little bit of time in there, and we did a few things, and then they launched the swine flu campaign. That was in 1976, the swine flu campaign. They were going to inoculate 200 million Americans. And I had a major scientist working with me who had been inside vaccines since the Second World War, and he was saying, this is like crazy. Part of this slideshow that we're presenting, each of the slides here will be the opening slide for another slideshow, which we're going to put on, maybe be a talk or something, about each of the stories I'm telling and more full and how they work, because this is a whole picture of how this culture is working. So here's the head of HEW, a famous American, a writer, a very smart guy, founder of Common Cause, saying, I was in charge and something was going on and I didn't even know about it. Vaccine regulation. Would you look into it? So I started looking into it. One of the things I did was I talked to the New York Times reporter on health. I said, there's a lot of bad things going on in vaccines. He said, I'll get back to you. He comes back to me, he says, I looked in my files and I don't see anything wrong. That's what he said to me. I looked in my files and I don't see anything wrong. So we started on, had these hearings and so on, and they fired the guy that ran it, they eliminated the agency. We had a Justice Department decision on opinion that they were violating the law. All kinds of stuff went on, and then the swine flu thing comes along. And they tried to inoculate 200 million Americans, and we started in on saying, you know, we went up to Capitol Hill and we said, you know how bad this is? And there's a whole story about that, which we can tell you. But you know how bad this is? Every single one of the health people, and there were about 8 of them, every single one of these are health aides, senior health aides on the Senate and the House side, said, yes, we know how bad it is, but we can't do anything about it because if we try, they'll create a swine flu epidemic. That's what they said. Okay, so we had an investigative reporter working with us, and he was putting out all kinds of stuff all the time. We just smash, 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 and they thought it was dead. That is, the investigative reporter did. I remember a Sunday night telling us, the Washington Star said, you guys won. They're not going to do it. The Senate will never approve this bill. And I said, I don't think that's right. I think they're going to approve it because, and he said, why? It's because they're going to have a swine flu epidemic. So the next morning, you know, 12 hours later, there was an announcement that 6 veterans had died in a hotel in Philadelphia. And it's called Legionnaire's disease now. You've heard of Legionnaire's disease? Have you heard of Legionnaire's disease? And they said, we can't rule out swine flu. They said we can't rule it out on Monday, we can't rule it out on Tuesday, we can't rule it out on Wednesday. On Thursday, they had a huge hearing at the Senate, and the Senate committee passed the bill. The issue was, were the companies going to be relieved of liability? If they weren't going to be relieved of liability, they weren't going to make the vaccine. If they were relieved of liability, they would make the vaccine. And okay, 4 days of pound, they passed the bill. And the next day, the CDC announced that we can rule out swine flu. Oh. Now that was, you know, how does this stuff work? And it was bizarre. Then we had to just pound away and pound away and pound away, and we stopped them at 49 million. That we figured it was, that means we were 151 million to 49 million we won, because that's how many people we saved from getting the vaccine. But a few people died. I mean, this is not a good thing at all. And really, if there's anybody that has any doubt about the flu vaccine, just don't take it. I mean, there's 100 reasons why not to take it. My inside person that was talking to me was brought in specifically to CDC, not to CDC, but the Division of Biologic Standards, to stop the swine flu by his boss at the Division of Biologic Standards. We met with the founder of CDC. The founder of CDC, we met with him. He was at that point a professor of public health at Harvard. And he said, I was fired from CDC in the 1960s because I refused to make the required annual announcement to go get your flu vaccine. And I thought we had really scored something big. Virology itself was under the gun there, because this idea that viruses cause diseases is only one of the things, if it does, one of the things that's involved in the disease situation. What I like to say is, if you were to spray this room right now with some kind of an agent, a few people would get sick and a bunch of people wouldn't. And the whole scientific research would be on the people that got sick, and nothing about why the people that didn't get sick. And yet, if we knew why the people didn't get sick, we might know more about what to do in the next room. But that's not the way it works. So I figured at this point there was a lot of problems about virology. And the next thing that I discovered, almost immediately, there's this strange disease out in San Francisco, and these gay men are getting it. They started calling it a viral disease, and pretty soon we've got AIDS. Now, right at that same time, the biggest critic of that whole AIDS hypothesis shows up in my office, and we start talking. Member of Duisberg. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the only retrovirus scientist in the Academy, and he's saying this can't be causing this disease. It can't be. It's got to be something else. Went to the National Academy of Sciences and spoke. The next day, the Washington Post has an article about this crank that showed up and made these really stupid statements. I mean, that's basically what the article was. Didn't say he was a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Didn't say he was the only retrovirus expert in the National Academy of Sciences. And just began right there painting him as a complete quack. And he continued to fight, and then, hundreds of scientists joined him, several Nobel Prize winners saying that the whole AIDS hypothesis is highly suspect. Now, my view is I don't have a position on whether it's suspect or not suspect, but I do have a position on the fact that the debate was never held. There was never a serious discussion of that issue because all the people who were raising different ideas were excluded. Right about that time, right following that was when Barbara Loe Fisher created the NVIC, and my story there is that I was working with Harry Coulter about homeopathy and health and so forth, and he asked me what subject could he write his next book on. And I'd been doing this vaccine stuff, and I said pertussis. I mean, I was sitting in the room when the guy that's in control of regulating pertussis at that time said it is the dirtiest substance put into the body of a human being. This is a guy, he knows it's bad. He knows it's bad. He knows kids are dying. He's in charge of the whole. I said, write a book about that. And the next thing was that Barbara and Harry wrote the book, Shot in the Dark. And then the third person that was involved in that process was an interesting person in my situation, because he had been my partner in fighting the free speech battle at Ohio State when we were in undergraduate school. Basically, it was 1961 and 62. And he came and became a staffer in the House Health Subcommittee, and he was also a person that was a friend, and we invited him to our house. And we had already started, and at that time, fighting the vaccine issue. We're saying, our kids aren't going to get. We got kicked out of several pediatric practices until we found a really good doctor, and he really guided us through the whole vaccine stuff back in 1968, 69, 70, 71, in that period. My friend heard all of this, and he didn't want to listen. My friend, he said, I just can't take it. I can't sit and listen to this about the vaccines. Because my wife at the time, Mary Turner, was really tough, still is, in terms of everything, but in terms of vaccines in particular. And my friend goes home, and his baby died from a vaccine. And he became the third person in starting the stuff that led to NVIC, Jeff Schwartz. And he's still around, and he's got a foundation named after his daughter. And that's complicated. Now that is about how, on what I call a transactional basis, we'll get to that, you're not doing the slides. You're supposed to keep me on time.
Well, that's not what happened.
The whole notion of the structure of activism is what you aspire to. That's the whole whatever we're going to call health freedom. Then it's the transactions, what you actually do. It's what you do personally, and it's what you do transactionally in the actual trenches on the fights and so forth. And then there's what I call the operational stuff. That's where you work hard to be as aspirational in your transactions as you can, to marry them up. One thing that happens is everybody fights for their aspirations and falls on their face because they didn't do any of the transactions. There's another batch that fights for the transactions like crazy. They're clawing each other to death over the transactions, and the aspirations fall by the wayside. Putting them together is crucial in order to make an impact on any given issue. And you have to draw it out of your own experience in your own life. That's the way it works. So Diana already said that I gave the first keynote at the first Health Freedom Congress, and that's that's where we were. It's very similar to today, almost, And then these are things that were done at that conference, and you can see there's an aspirational piece, there's transactional, and then there's the operational stuff and those are things that we did at that conference, and you're still using them. I noticed one was in the pamphlet that was passed out today. One of the things I proposed, and I continue to work for, is that the UN definition of health talks about health being more than just, and then they name all the things, but they don't name spiritual. And I want to convince the UN to put spiritual as part of one of the definition of health. One of the things that I've adopted, and I have to adopt this just in order to survive on a daily basis, if my choice is between conspiracy and stupidity, I pick stupidity. I mean, it's just a lot easier to deal with. You know, first of all, if you have to fight it in court, it's really hard to prove conspiracy in court. Pretty easy to prove stupidity. I mean, so I go for stupidity. And I'm telling you, you talk to these people, and it's just amazing. It's just amazing. I went to the FDA about the first big health food, or actually dietary supplement action, which Clinton Miller created. 50,000 postcards to FDA in the summer of 1968 about FDA trying to restrict dietary supplements. They had a big hearing on dietary supplements. And 50,000 postcards. So I'm saying to this person from the FDA, I'm saying, hey, 50,000 postcards saying you're wrong. How do you handle that? Yeah, 50,000 quacks. That was the quote, 50,000 quacks. This is my first summer in Washington, and I'm saying, well, okay, let's try to figure that one out. And I went to Nader and I said, look, there's 50,000 postcards to the FDA saying that dietary supplements should not be harassed. And they say it's 50,000 quacks. And Nader looks at me and says, quacks? Quacks, they're consumers. So from then on, I just said 50,000 consumers. And the fact is that in every single issue, the consumer voice has more traction than any other voice. More than the professionals, more than the businesses, it has more traction. Now, the problem with the consumer voice is it is really hard to organize, really hard to focus. Very difficult, extremely difficult. Okay, this is aspiration. That's Dana's favorite slide.
It's my favorite slide. I learned this trick on the lunch.
Go ahead. Switch them. Now, okay, now this is a Mobius strip, and I want to get across, each one of these has like a little thing to introduce it. You have to understand that there's no beginning and no end to activism. You're just always on the trip. You can take a day off or so and do something else for a while,
There's always something new.
But it just keeps going. I mean, and it is like a Mobius strip, and it's just important to understand that. And it's been going on for centuries. I mean, I think that we're engaging the energy that the amoeba used to get out of the slime. That's what we're doing. And I actually think that the time I heard, one of the statements was that these difficult times. But actually, these are, yes, difficult, but they also have enormous opportunity.
Yeah.
I learned working on acupuncture that the Chinese character that is for danger and opportunity at the same time. The tougher it gets, the more opportunity there is to have impact. We have a real opportunity to make lots of changes going forward from here on out, and that's part of what the whole thing is about. And then I use these principles, which I borrowed from Gandhi through the Erik Erikson's biography of Gandhi, which is I'm just going to say them. They're not going to be the way they're there, but never forget the humanity of your adversary. Very crucial. One of the main reasons is you never know when an adversary is going to come over to your side. And most people are neutral on everything. So why create trouble by being nasty? Just remember they're human beings. Then the next thing is that if you're going to move forward, this says don't try to tear down something for which you don't have an alternative. I believe that all activism should be for something. All activism should be for health freedom. It should be for, nutritional food. It should be for. Because if you're against bad stuff, the energy just doesn't work effectively. The main reason for that is that the vast majority of people have no idea what you're talking about. And if you start saying negative stuff, they're going to say, I don't want to. But if you say, I'm for really good food, people say, oh, good, I like good food. That sounds pretty good. And pretty soon you're dealing with an energy that's positive, and you actually get positive things going. Then the final point of this particular structure is all change comes from the people. That's Gandhi said that. All change comes from the people. Everything else is static. Everything else is status quo. Everything else is hold on to things. People are the driving force for creating whatever's going to come next, whatever that may be. Then one of the most important concepts that you've heard a million times is the greatest good for the greatest number. How many have heard that? That is a kind of misstatement of what really was said originally, but here's what Gandhi had to say about that. I don't like the greatest good for the greatest number, because that means some people are going to be left behind. The actual statement, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That was the premise, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's the driving force. I use that as my fundamental principle for activism and organizing, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. How do you get to be happy? This is from the Scottish Enlightenment. How do you get to be happy? By making other people happy. Everybody can be happy. Not just some people, everybody. So you want the greatest happiness for everybody. Okay, what are we on now? I want you guys to take a look at that sentence. What does that sentence say to you? This sentence is not true. How could it not be true? If it's not true, then it's true. Because it says it's not true. What? Does that like, it's like a Mobius strip, right? Okay, understand, that's the concept, the knot right in there, upon which our entire structure is built. Our whole scientific system is built on that structure. What we are allowed to believe are those things which we are not able to disprove. That's what it is, right there. That's the null hypothesis. You can look it up. Our entire scientific system is built around what can you prove? If you can't disprove the hypothesis is treated as true. It creates a lot of difficulty for a lot of things. So that brings you to the law part of that, which is the burden of proof. Okay, so I have a little story here. One of the things I got into was I was on a committee of the White House Office of Technology, Science and Technology. And that office was the office to create a science court. Now, concept, science court. Very important American scientists got this idea we should have a science court. You know, like the lawyers have the Supreme Court, we're going to have a science court. We're going to get 9 people, we'll put them in black robes, set them up, and then this side gets presented, this guy gets presented, and then they vote. And I go to this meeting, and they got like 40 of the country's leading scientists. And this guy, who's a really good guy, I mean, I liked him. He was a very smart guy, very interesting guy, is talking through like this, you know? And I raised my hand. I was the only lawyer. So I raised my hand, and I said, excuse me, but you know, you guys are all from universities. And every one of your universities has a place that considers these kinds of issues called a law school. Why don't you get your law professors to come and talk to you about this? And more and more. I said, well, just a minute. When the Supreme Court votes 5-4 that you cannot use evidence that's gotten from somebody who hasn't been given a warning, the Miranda warning, voila, 5-4, that's the law. If a group of people in 1492 had voted 5-4 that the earth is flat, it would not have become flat. So the president of Rockefeller University, his answer to that point, they never would have voted that way. Okay, let's try to go back. That's what's known as a pedagogical error. So I continue to talk to these guys, and I'm saying things like, he says, Turner, here's what we want you to do. We want you to go in there and you present your argument that aspartame, we were fighting aspartame at the time, NutraSweet, aspartame is unsafe. And then they come in and they got to answer you. I said, no, you don't understand. They got to prove that it's unsafe, or else we treat, they got to prove that it's safe, or else we treat it as unsafe. That's what I want to have happen. And that's the burden of proof. If the burden of proof is on me, I lose. If it's on him, he loses. Like that.
But your point.
Yeah, I know. That's my point. That's what happens. So, okay, now you can overcome you can meet your burden of proof sometimes. That's possible, but you're really working uphill if you're doing burden of proof. So he says to me, okay, well, we just want to do facts. We do not want to do soft science, we want to do hard science. So let's just take the airplanes that fly into LaGuardia, and there's a housing project. And the housing project and the planes fly over, and the kids are playing in the yard, and we only want to know about the cracks in the building. We do not want to know about the psychological damage to the kids, because that's too hard, that's soft science. Cracks in the building, that's hard science. That's what we're going to put in the court, the science court. So I said, well, what about this question? Planes fly over, impair kids' hearing, and they have behavioral problems. Is that in the factual side, or is that in the soft science side? And he says, Turner, you ask the darndest questions. Then we walk out, I'm walking out with him, and he says, Jim, I have a question for you. Do you have a book about this law stuff? I said, we've got, in my office, I have a 123-volume set called Proof of Facts. 123 volumes. He says, no. We've got a little book, it's about 20 pages, and it's called Physics for Poets. Do you have anything like that? Is that a conspiracy? I mean, look, we're in a mindset. It's called the Western mindset. It's a very good set. Now, this is a book I would like everybody to read if they're interested in knowing what to read about. And this talks about a guy named Charles Saunders Peirce, who, have you ever heard of him, anybody?
No.
He's America's most respected philosopher. And nobody's heard of him. What about that? That's pretty weird. So anyway, he's got the answer. He's got an antidote to the null hypothesis. And he was trying, how do you form a hypothesis? He says, that's the question. So he said, the way you form a hypothesis is you go along and you see something and you say, whoa, that's something that doesn't fit my belief system. That's the first premise. The next premise is, for him and empiricists and people who are working on finding out what's real, the next question is, what about my belief system can I change in order to account for this thing I've seen that doesn't fit my current belief system? That's not what the bureaucrats do. They start out all kinds of things, hide the evidence, pretend you didn't see it, deny that you saw it. I mean, it's on every issue. Every issue. But then what you do after the third point is, what is the hypothesis I can formulate to see if the way I want to change my view or change my beliefs accounts for the thing I saw? That's all spelled out. That's Peirce and his wife. And she was a problem for him, not in his relationship with her, but in the world, because the academics didn't like her. And I could never figure out why they didn't like her, but he kept getting in trouble because of her. Then I found out she was an actress. She'd appeared on Broadway, so that's it. Later, I found out she was a gypsy. Then I knew. Now, the most interesting thing to me about her is that she took all his papers and brought them to Harvard and gave them to Harvard, and then in the 1920s and early 30s, Whitehead, who's one of the most famous American worldwide philosophers, had his papers organized, and they came out and have created a huge philosophical framework that nobody actually recognizes, but is used. This guy, the Metaphysical Club, got the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2002, and it's a very, very important set of thoughts, and there's a whole lot of work being done on that. It's about empiricism. It's about how you look at reality and integrate it into your transactions. And if you can look at reality, aspiration, you can integrate it into your transactions effectively, you can come up with activist operational behavior that causes stuff to shift. Now, this is another piece of that same picture And the question that underlies autopoiesis, it's called autopoiesis, the question that underlies that is, if a plant changes, or you as a human being, changes your entire physical cell structure, 7 years for humans perhaps, a certain amount for plants, it changes. At this point, the plant is completely 100% physically different than it was at this point. What makes it the same plant? The autopoietic nexus is what these guys said. There were two Chilean scientists, one of them was Varela, and they worked really hard on the fact that there's this deep energetic dynamic underway that causes things to have essential reality independent of their physical material expression. And that is a key part of any kind of organizational, what I call operational activism. Key to understand. You're dealing with the inner self, the inner source in everything, even though we're talking about, poison food additives. But it's the inner self that is the unifying principle. It's not only true for an individual, it's true for a group, it's true for a pair. We have an acre of land in the city of Washington, D.C. That's pretty amazing to me. And we have a neo-biodynamic set of gardens on that land. It's only neo because we put biodynamic in for about 20 years, and then the people got tired of doing it and went away. But we have what I lovingly call burned out bureaucrats, 10 of them who come out and have beds, and they work that. And that biodynamics is working off this inner energetics. We actually got a front page article in the Wall Street Journal once that said, what do you get if you take a goat's skull, fill it with a bunch of preparations, then you bury it beside the river during a full moon? Biodynamic farming. But it's a very important concept to know about. Okay, next. Oh, and then this is a third one. It's really important to understand. It's called biotensegrity. Biotensegrity. Again, here's this man. He's a back surgeon. He's 85 years old now. Stephen Levin. He's in Washington, D.C. He's actually in McLean, Virginia. And he's saying, I'm a back surgeon, and whatever this back surgeon is about, it ain't helping backs. So he says, what is this all about? He says, I'm going to go down to the Smithsonian, and I'm going to look at the dinosaur bones. And I'm going to see what I can see in the dinosaur back that will help me understand why what they're telling me to do to these human backs isn't working. He gets down there, he can't figure it out, and he goes and he sits on a bench, and he looks over at the just brand new open Hirschhorn Sculpture Museum, and there is in the front of it something called the Schnelling Tower. You can go look at it. We should probably have a picture of that. But this is well, this is our next round.
And we have 51 more slides.
Now, understand, you see that geodesic dome that's sitting there? That is from Buckminster Fuller. It's an architectural concept, and it's interlocking triangles. Interlocking triangles, and it's a way. It's the most. You're supposed to use the point. So anyway.
Here we go. Ready?
Right? No.
Okay.
Not yet. So he's looking at that. He's saying, "Holy cow!" From 1974 to yesterday, he's been showing that everything we believe about how the body works physically, muscularly and so forth, is wrong. Our system engages, it integrates, Betsy, what does it integrate? Say it again? Tension and compression. Tension and compression. And it's the integration of that tension and progression that allows us to stand up, to walk around, to climb things. We could not do the things that we do just on the basis of pure physical body energy or force or muscles. So I am here to tell you that's true about organizing. Just in a when we showed you the original slide, there were 4 things on there. One was my transpartisan voice material. Transpartisan is built around the fact that politics actually always has 3 answers to every question. And you're going to vote for A or B or not. There's 3 right there, A, B, or neither. The neither now is about 70% of the public in a vote. That's the group that is actually defining where we're going. When you do your organizing about anything, think about that group. 99.9% of the people know nothing about homeopathy. But all of them are happy to leave it alone, as long as there's no reason not to leave it alone. So keep that in mind. You don't have to run out there and convert them to homeopathy or to natural healing or to health freedom. What you got to do is say, we want to have the right to do what we want to do, and it's not going to cost you anything or harm you in any way. Now you've got something to work with. That's the biointegrity issue put into activist politics. Then the last one is this is a political dynamic out of something called the integral movement, which a person named Ken Wilber is the leading spokesperson of. And he is arguing that we are in a developmental process and we're about to go from tier 1 to tier 2, and it's going to switch everything. And we're right in the middle of that right now. And you can read all kinds of stuff about it. And this is the guy that's putting that to use in politics. And you know, he tries different kinds of political things, and there still is not quite the energy there to make the political stuff happen the way the integral people would. But it's a very important part of how or where we're going. Now we're ready for more questions.
Repeat them.
Nobody has any questions? Yes, right there.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions on things you've done for Sally Fallon. 15 years ago, she wanted you to file a petition with FDA to take a soy product off the market that was made by Cargill. What was the eventual outcome of that?
Well, the petition was actually not to get soy products off the market, but to prevent.
Particular product.
Well, it was to prevent the FDA from allowing them to make heart-healthy claims. The issue was you can't make a heart-healthy claim for soy because it's not heart-healthy, and presented a huge amount of facts. Nothing from the FDA until 2008, and they did something, and we responded to that. And we said, wait a minute, this is like crazy. Put in more evidence. Then in 2014, we filed a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit, saying the FDA's been sitting on this since 1999. Why are you sitting on this? And we got into the big thing that goes on. That was 2014. And the FDA then announced that it was going to stop allowing those heart-healthy claims for soy. They announced that in 2016, or 2017. They announced that. But we don't like their announcement because they said they were going to leave open the possibility that you could use, they said the data doesn't support a heart-healthy claim. But they're going to leave open the possibility that you can have a limited claim that the data suggests that it does. And we're in court now saying, no, you can't do that because the data all shows that it's harmful. It's harmful to the heart. We're saying we've got data that shows that. Why are you going to let you? So that's where we are. That's the answer to your question. The question was, where's the soy protein that wasn't a price file?
One other question on the soy prison lawsuit. Where are you on that right?
Say again?
The prisoners complaining about.
Right. That's not gotten into at least it's not with me. It's not gotten into a legal framework. It's still trying to persuade the prisons not to feed soy to prisoners. I mean, just think about it. I mean, we've got prisoners who are being harmed by all kinds of bad health practices, and there's no health freedom for them. Period. None. And that's one of the main points I want to make here is that every time I start an issue, I start with the little baby doll at the right. Almost always, that's the inspector that goes to a plant and says, "You guys really screwed up." I want to know who's that person, what did they say, why did they say it? Or even sometimes before, we had a big fight over the accreditation system for Life Chiropractic College taking away their accreditation. And we had to figure out how to get it back. And I just went down there myself. I didn't tell anybody, and I went down and walked all over the place, talked to students, tried to figure out, that's getting down at the bottom we're at the tiny little end of this. And from that, you can start building up, and there's a reason for that. When the inspector makes the inspector's statement and then turns it into the boss, from that time on, the issue with the FDA or any regulatory agency is defending that inspector and that statement. It is no longer what's the substance of the issue. So all of a sudden, in every issue, you have three things. I've already started to try to say that. You have those things you can prove that are, quote, true, those things you can, or positive, and then you can, those things that are false or negative, you can prove those. There's a bunch of those and a bunch of those. The vast majority of all the arguments are in this so-called gray area. Now, the FDA and all regulators want all gray area to be treated as if it were in the black zone, that it's bad, whatever it is. Our team wants the vast majority, if not all, of the gray area to be treated as if it is good or positive until you can prove that it's negative. So there are battles that go around this line, there are battles that go around this line, and then there's the big battle over where does that gray stuff go. Is it generally treated as positive, or is it generally treated as negative? And that is where the burden of proof comes in. If you can, and our health freedom argument is every individual has the right to make choices for themselves, even bad choices. They have the right to say, I want to try this thing. Now what happens when you start doing that is a whole different set of standards begins to emerge. We're right in the middle now of the homeopathy struggle with FDA. And one of the things that's coming up, first of all, they are so confused, they have no idea what they're talking, they don't even know what it is that they're dealing with. But when you say, listen, we believe that we should start with homeopathy and then go to other stuff if the homeopathy doesn't work. And that is such a foreign notion to them. Because their position is, you got to try the stuff we know that works, the drugs, and if they fail, then you can go to homeopathy. Now, that doesn't seem to me, that's not a hard argument for me to win if I can get it in the right forum. I mean, a judge is going to say, what? You can't. So, I'm just saying, think about the three parts. This is the Kennedy Bill of Rights for Consumers presented to Congress in 1962. And that starts with the right to information. I don't know if I'll have it in the right order, but the right to information, the right to choice, the right to safety, and the right to be heard. Notice, informed choice is the key thing. That's what motivates, that's what brings the consumer voice into the whole debate. And that voice changes. It's like dropping, as I say, a homeopathic remedy into the middle of the argument. If they've got to start thinking about consumers, or they can be affected by consumers, or they will cause them to act differently, if the consumer steps up. And I will tell you, one day I was sitting over there, and about 500 or 1,000 AIDS activists, they were called, they didn't want to be called AIDS victims, they wanted to be called people with AIDS, picketed the FDA, blocked it. 95% of the employees of FDA could not get in to work because they're saying we want access to the experimental drugs that might help us. And the FDA felt, all the people inside the FDA felt, keeping those drugs that hadn't been proven to be safe and effective off the market was helping these people. And here they are saying, no, 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 we want them. Even if they're dangerous, we want them. And it just completely shattered the FDA staff's view of reality. Because now the people they thought they were helping were sitting there saying, you're harming us. And they changed some of their rules so you could use those drugs. That was one of the things that happened. So that's the chemical feast. And I just wanted to point out that we said people inside and outside the FDA work to help us. And that's true in every single issue I've ever been on. People inside the system and outside the system, whichever one it is that you're criticizing, attacking, debating, holding up and sort of, people in that institution or framework are also raising the same questions. And we had people in the FDA. Now the FDA commissioner sent a little note around saying the naders. We got government. What?
We got 15 minutes.
Government identity cards. They can go home. I'll just keep talking. They gave us FDA. They gave us federal government identity cards that said Naders Raiders on it. The FDA. So we went in there and we would go and talk to people in the FDA. I remember I went to one scientist, and the commissioner of FDA sent a letter out saying, the Naders Raiders are going to come and talk to you, treat them with dignity, treat them kindly, yada, yada, yada. And so we go to talk to this scientist, and he takes out this paper, puts it on the table, says, treat them nicely, and he pulls out of his pocket a little wheel book, we call them in the Navy, wheel book, little book of notes. And it's all the things he'd been writing all his career about what a terrible place FDA was. And he starts reading them to us. He's got the little paper there, and he's reading them to us. And we got all this information. I mean, it is a understand, it's a police force. It's cops. It's not scientific. It has no scientific capacity at all. In fact, we talked to the first person that was hired as an FDA science job, FDA scientific assistant commissioner. And we talked to him. He worked there for 2 years and then quit. He was a well-known, very popular, and very solid scientist. And he told us, I remember, I was at his home in Bethesda, Maryland. He said, I am ashamed that I ever worked for the FDA. Now, understand, the way I look at this is a pathology of some kind. You know, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's a pathology. And part of that pathology is it is manipulated like crazy by the people it regulates. That was the second book we wrote, and that book was a combination of recipes and why you should eat good and muckraking of the baby food industry. And it was a pretty good, nice little book. You should look it up and read it sometime. Alan Chadwick was the American leader of biodynamic farming, and when I ran into biodynamic farming and I ran into homeopathy, I thought those are the two major sets of ideas that could actually make a big difference, and neither one of them was organized enough to actually make a political action out of. So we did step back to acupuncture, and the idea was to mainstream acupuncture, and we worked, a whole bunch of people, and I was a part of that, and got it mainstreamed. I knew it was mainstream because we saw an ad. We tried to find it, couldn't get it. It's a great ad. We'll find it.
Yeah.
And it's a bottle of Budweiser with acupuncture needles in it. It said, "Acupuncturist, this bud's for you." Mm-hmm. That's the day I knew acupuncture had mainstreamed. Now we can move on to another issue. With regard to biodynamic farming, we couldn't do that, so we stepped back to organic. Organic is the best of the industrial system. It is not yet over the hump into being an actually integrated, fully operative body, mind, spirit system, but it's better than most of the other stuff out there. And that was a big battle. We'll go into that. Now the sweeteners one, we started out, and the first thing that happened...
Arthur Hall Hayes was appointed as President Reagan's new FDA commissioner.
And that commissioner of the FDA, overruling 3 outside scientists and 3 internal scientists working in the FDA process, who said it should not be marketed. That commissioner overruled these people and said, I'm going to let it go on the market in spite of these rulings.
Attorney Jim Turner is a consumer advocate with Citizens for Health.
It's considered to be generally recognized as safe when they had all kinds of data saying it wasn't safe. So we said, you can't, if you want to market this thing, then you got to go show us that you've got data to market it. They couldn't. So the HHS secretary took it off the market, and then all over the world, countries figured out ways to get it on the market, except for the U.S., where it's still illegal. Now, I think that's pretty interesting. That is, to me, that is an invalidation of a process that uses the system and works it to come up with your outcome, as opposed to constantly opposing and fighting and trying to undermine it. Now, I have to tell you that secretary took it off the market at that point, got fired. And lots of the people that have done the right thing in the government have gotten fired. But still, cyclamate still isn't on the market in the U.S. And I can tell you that's a good thing.
In 1981,
Skip that one. Leo knows we've been working on Consumers for Dental Choice. I was very happy to launch Charlie Brown into the middle of that. For several years we worked together on that, and then it just got so big in our office that we couldn't keep it there. But Charlie's out there working on all the dental stuff. We've gone to court a couple of times, not terribly successfully, but we're going to try again soon. That's the Budweiser, that should have been Budweiser, we couldn't find it. The Universal Product Code, I got involved in the Universal Product Code, and that got me into how the information system stuff is going to work. The Universal Product Code is that little box that you see. There's 2 of them now, but that's one of them. And huge amounts of standardization information in there. Up until that came along, the food industry was opposed to standardized packaging. When that came along, they said, whoa, we can standardize stuff and it'll be great. Now all of a sudden they're on our side. We ultimately, they were taking all the prices off the products in the supermarket at that point, and we had a big fight about that, and ultimately they found out that it was costing them money to take prices off the products, so they kept them on for a while. Okay, go to the next. Oh, and then Hahnemann was, I told you that homeopathy was like the major set of ideas, and it's extremely important because the driving force of what we're talking about in all of this activism is how individuals are able to express themselves in the system in a way that allows them to make their lives and the lives of the world congruent. Then that's a driving individual force, and that's where homeopathy is grounded, in the individual. And there are other things grounded in the individual as well, but the individual driving forward is what this is about. I think Diane talked about that right in our first session 2 days ago. The individual is driving forward, and that's what we're doing in this culture, and that's what we're about. And every generation's had this fight. This was our swine flu battle, and they put that. When things are getting a little dicey, they put the president on getting a shot, and it turned out he had gotten the wrong vaccine. So we were able to turn that into an asset for our side of the argument. Go ahead and show that one if you want.
4 scientists in charge of work on the flu vaccine during the 1960s found it to be ineffective, said they refused to give it to their own families. 2 were transferred to other work, a 3rd left the division. And over the entire 10-year period, not one word of their unfavorable findings was allowed to be published.
The control officer in 1960, who has grave doubts about the potency of influenza vaccine. These doubts were made known to the director of the division and through the proper channels, and somewhat subsequent to that time, within a year or so, that person was transferred to other duties in the DPF.
That was 1973. So understand, the vaccine, I'm going to tell you something. I think that the California mandate is the best thing that happened to the vaccine movement. You know, because it got people saying, holy cow. And people who don't even know anything about fake vaccines are going to say, what do you mean that mandate a vaccine? We've been trying to get people interested in that issue for years. And now, huge interest because of the mandate. As long as and I'm for philosophical opt-out, I've been for a long time. I thought that was the main vulnerability that the whole vaccine world had. And if we can get it back in California and spread it across the country, then we can have the debate that we need, which is why are people doing this anyway? It's not a sensible thing when you look at it scientifically. Now, let me, before you do the thing, so here, organic food, it was 1990, we had a huge battle on organic food. That'll be more slides later. And then I want to show you what happens, because in every instance, you make progress, and then the big corporate behemoth comes in. So Amazon now owns Whole Foods. And Jeff Bezos says, yeah, I liked it. It was kind of a nice little store. Go ahead. Okay, so we're not going to do questions, you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Operations. Go for it. This is where you integrate them. And the main point here with this one is you don't win by force. And now this is Adam Smith. This is the guy that created all of the ideas that this system argues for economically. Except that they lie when they talk about it. Look at that. Read it up there. Consumption is the sole end and purpose of consumption, the sole end and purpose of all production. The producer's interest, I'm doing it from memory, so I'll probably be exactly right, but the producer's interest should be attended to only insofar as it advances the interest of the consumer. The laws aren't like that. This is 1776. The laws aren't like that. Why not? Because the merchants and manufacturers have screwed around with the laws and made them be anti-consumer. The American Revolution, in part, was a consumer revolution. You have to understand that the tea that went into Boston Harbor was not the King's tea, it was the East India Company's tea. Big, huge corporation. That was a revolution against concentrated government power and concentrated economic power. Now, it was a fact that they were intertwined very tightly, not like today. You know, government and they're just very, right? So you understand, where we are today and where we were then, very similar. Very much the same battle. At the peak of the popularity of the American Revolution, 1/3 of the people in these colonies supported the revolution. 1/3. Important to know. Okay, these are things that I got involved in trying to make this stuff move, and I just thought it'd be worth your looking at. That was the This is the book that we introduced Transpartisan in 2008. And then, again, this is similar to the Mobius strip. Understand, no matter what you do, if you're a rock, there's paper around somewhere. If you're paper, there's a scissors around somewhere. And if you're scissors, there's a rock around somewhere. And so you always want to be alert to the fact that you're constantly going. So then we go to the idea of, I believe, and this was what was built on the Kennedy Bill of Rights and the Nader activity, that you have all these forces working: the individual, the consumer, the producer, and that's the retailer. But that's also practitioners. I mean, it's anybody at the point of purchase, basically. So go ahead. And the whole system, we created a system in which we have conceptually, from the middle of the 19th century, argued about capital and labor. And it was conceptualized that was the debate in the culture, capital and labor. But capital and labor are both on the production side of the point of purchase. And so basically the labor capital debate, when a meeting, when they're sitting down writing the contract, is how can we get together and screw the consumer? I mean, that's really what it boils down to. And that's, okay, so, maybe I'm on capital side in some things, maybe I'm on labor side in some things, but in all things, it's the consumer that is the driving force that needs to be freed. The shackles off the consumer to make the system work. Otherwise, you're just caught in that kind of mess. Same point, basically, right? Now, the matrix is down there on the left, and then you have government, academia, and media sitting outside, mostly in service of the people who are in power. I mean, that's basically, I'm trying to understand, these are structural things. These are bad people, this is wrong, this is terrible. They're structural. Go to the next. So in the middle of all of these battles, I saw that the corporate people had huge resources, and they would scan an issue, and they would try to decide, is it a scientific issue? Are we strong on science? Are we strong on law? And we want to have a public policy that helps us. So if they were strong on science, they would argue it's a science issue. If they were strong on law, they would argue that it's a law issue. And we would have to figure out how to relate to that. So on science, it was fascinating in the food area. They feed additives to animals. All the time they feed additives to animals. And then they say, see, it didn't hurt the animals, you can eat it. Then you feed it to the animals get sick, and they say, well, animals aren't people. And you must have seen that argument all the time, don't you see it? And one of the most important things is to recognize that's what's going on if you want to have a battle. Because you get trapped into fighting over, did it poison him or doesn't it? And then there you'll see these very bizarre things like, this is the most tested additive that's ever been tested. And over and over and over they say that about every additive. It's crazy. So then what I use as a metaphor is the established order is A. And the people who are critical of the established order are B through Z. If you get trapped into trying to figure out what B through Z should agree on in order to fight A, you lose. So just remember, when you're sitting around saying, what should we do? So what I'm saying, this is my law of choice, the law of choice. B through Z, every one of those issues, B through Z, or those things, has choice as it's one of its key components. I want to use homeopathy, I want to use acupuncture. I mean, I understand all of these things are illegal at some point. All of them. Now, that choice concept is the thing that can actually be something that helps people get organized to focus on the real thing. And they don't have to be unified. All they have to do is act for choice and just systematically act for choice across the board. And what you'll find is somebody who wants to say, I want choice for smart meters. I want to have the right not to have a smart meter because of the EMF question. If you try to convince somebody that they should not have a smart meter, you lose. You just say, look, I want to have the right to have a smart meter. What is it? What am I kidding? I want a smart meter. The guy next door to you isn't going to fight you over that. They're just not going to fight you about that. But if you go over there and say, listen, you shouldn't have a smart meter, you're going to have a lot of trouble. You should have, because they won't know what you're talking about unless they're already in the situation. Choice, we think choice will unite things. And remember, the rule was, or the law was, any individual activist is a minority in whatever issue they're in. They're a minority. But collectively, all individual activists working for choice are a majority. I mean, just across the board, because everybody's got something they want to do that with. And that's kind of what this shows. Go ahead to the next one. Then we did that before, but that's the same point. Now, we talked about Gandhi being unhappy with the greatest good for the greatest number, and this is what we did to edit it so that you can see what actually does make sense. And you can read it up there. But the main point is happiness is a much better tool if you're in your own mind. I mean, you don't have to campaign, you don't have to make signs, you don't have to do, just in your own mind. What am I doing here? I'm trying to create tools and opportunities for people to advance their own happiness, to live their lives more in congruence with who they are, to express themselves, to have the kind of health that's best for them, to have the kind of food that's good for them. And they make that decision, not somebody else. They make that decision. And the more you can create that reality, the more the system will work to come up with good decisions. My partner in the transpartisan world says the key is getting people to choose the good. Now, you don't force them to have the good, you choose the good. Now listen, I'll tell you, if vaccines are the best thing that ever happened and you give people choice, they will find their way to vaccines. If they're the worst thing that ever happened, they'll find their way away from it. But if you start sitting down and saying, you should have vaccines, or you shouldn't have vaccines, either one. If you make a rule saying you can't have vaccines, you're going to have the same kind of message you have if you say you have to have vaccines. If people have choice, they will systematically evolve into making choices that are in their interest. As they make those choices, the whole situation will get happier and the world will become a better place. I mean, that's the large construct.
But now to Ronald Reagan in Hollywood. This is Ronald Reagan speaking to you from Hollywood. You know me as a motion picture actor. But tonight I'm just a citizen, pretty concerned about the national election next month, and more.
Reagan was a founder of Americans for Democratic Action, which is one of the leftist groups that there is in mainstream politics. He says he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him. But if you go and look at it, this is why we do transparency, if you go and look at his national security position, the one that the Republicans currently say brought down the Soviet Union, it was actually carried out by a very, very left-wing Democrat, Kempelman, who was Jimmy Carter's negotiator on arms control, who Reagan maintained. And Kempelman went into the cabinet and expressed his whole idea. Reagan said, go tell him. And he went and told him, and everyone in the cabinet voted against what Kempelman wanted to do. Reagan got him outside and he said, don't worry about it. I'm the only one in that room that used to be a Democrat. And then they adopted that policy and it became the policy that we live today. Now that is an example of transpartisan. It's important to understand. It's underneath. It's a driving force. Now this is another one of the fundamental driving forces, which is there you can go to the Chaotic Foundation, and it's bringing chaos and order together. It's chaotic. It's very, very similar to biotensegrity, because it's, again, okay, now what is it? Okay, this is the guy that invented it. His name is Dee Hock. He was a Bank of America card person from Seattle, Washington, and he invented something, the Visa card. The Visa card is the first $1 trillion business, had about 200 employees, and it was done on chaotic principles. And the idea, just a little sense of it, the Bank of America card people were arguing among all the banks that were part of Bank of America card about what interest they should charge. And he said, it doesn't matter. Every bank can charge its own interest. What you want is everybody to have a Visa card. And then they can fight over what the interest on that particular Visa card is. But and that's an example, and those are the principles of chaotic. These are examples of how the individual is gaining more and more power in the society. I mean, Airbnb, all of those things. Integrate chaos and order. That's our third most famous slide, most favorite slide, right?
I do like that slide.
Now that's all leading in the direction of something called blockchain, which is the backbone, the thing from which Bitcoin comes from. And how many have heard of Bitcoin? Whoa, as many as heard of Nader. That's amazing. So Bitcoin to, Nader to Bitcoin. So this is, blockchain is creating an individual, unhackable identity virtually that you can move anywhere and do anything. Bitcoin is a teensy-weensy little side issue. When you get into looking at the blockchain world, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of things going on that are enhancing the individual's ability to do stuff. In the world that we live in, more and more tools are falling into the hands of the individual. Activists now have the opportunity to figure out how to use these things. And that's where Dana comes in. Dana managed to get an impression, I told you, impressions, 2 billion impressions, 2 billion, roughly, is her team. That's roughly 1/3 of humanity, or close to 1/3 of humanity. And the kinds of communications that are underway now, they've been around all the time. Everybody talks about Twitter like it's some kind of new thing, but we grew up reading headlines in newspapers. How many people scan the paper and read the headline? That's Twitter. It's the same thing. I personally, on many occasions, made an arrangement with a cab driver to come and pick me up at the airport because I didn't want to wait in line. So I got my cab driver and I said, listen, I'll be coming in at 7:30, come and pick me up. He liked to do that. He could pick me up. He knew he had a ride. I'm sure other people did that. Well, now that's Uber, because that's what it is. You call the cab and it comes and picks you up. And the same thing with Airbnb. There used to be a whole system, we used to use it on vacations, where you found somebody in England that had a house and you switched houses. They come to Washington for 2 weeks, you go to London for 2 weeks. And it was a thing, it was there, it was a business. Now it's huge. Each thing that's coming along under the new technology that we have is handing more and more maneuverability, resource, self-expression opportunities to every individual. And we need to learn how to use that, and I think it's a very important part of how we take activism forward. That's how my argument that we're in a moment of opportunity. It's a moment of opportunity, not danger. There's danger, but the opportunity is there to really work with. And that's kind of the message, and that's what we're creating there. And I just wanted to, this is the same slide we started at the beginning, but my slide on that is going to be me. I'm going to talk about the stuff I talked about here, transparency review, transparency voice, and transparency review. You can go online now and find them. They're there. Can you got those things? You can hold them up for them. Then Citizens for Health has been around since the shade. Citizens Health was the consumer group. That's the transparency review that we put out. And it's online. Everything's online. And what we're talking about there is all the things going on now which are not broken down by left and right. It's left, right, order, freedom, and they're working together, and you'll find all kinds of people that are there as possible allies for any kind of health freedom that you want to undertake. Citizens for Health was the consumer group involved with the dietary supplement industry that generated 1.5 million letters to Congress in 1993, 94. Voice for Hope sends people up on the Hill who are healers, natural healers, excuse me, and they're consumers, and they go up and talk to their own congressional office. Denise ran that group for several years, right?
Right.
And you still like it, right?
I love it.
We have about 2,000 people on the list, roughly, something like that. Close. And we've had maybe 150 meetings on Capitol Hill, and we're just very quiet, and we make people come, and they really, really like to do it. They learn something. And then we created in 1976, as a part of following on the swine flu debacle, the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy. And just an example, one of we have our EMF stuff is run out of that, right? So we did another project in there which I always really like, and that was when Microsoft was sued for antitrust violations and lost. Microsoft is a criminal, lost. The judge said break it up, and the appeals court sent it back to do something other than break it up, and then the Bush administration, which was elected in the meantime, dropped the case. But we, through NESLAP, we generated 10,000 letters to the judge saying, we don't want you to break it up, we want access to the kernel. We want the ability to have, write rules to let people use the technology that Microsoft has. And we can write those rules in a way that will break up the monopoly without breaking up the company. And we got 10,000 letters in like that. I like that a lot, but then they dropped the case. The point is, though, that in every situation where it looks bleakest, there is an opportunity to be taken and move the activist ball forward. In my situation, I got involved with food, drugs, which was all of health, and then through the UPC and the Universal Product Code into the information stuff. And we work on those things and continuously work on them and just keep moving the ball forward, and you can see what happens on a lot of these things. There's a lot of victories there, and there's a lot of work left to be done. So that's it, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim Turner, for your courage and your example, and we have this little gift for you.
Well, thank you.
Hopefully you can pack that. And now we're going to move from the collaborative floor,